So our goal for lab this week is to prepare a dye-sensitized solar cell and to examine the effect of fruit dyes on the cell performance. Now, a dye-sensitized solar cell is an alternative to the silicon-based solar photovoltaics that we've talked about before. It still converts light to electricity and is made of cheap and abundant materials. So, like a photovoltaic, a dye-sensitized solar cell has 3 steps that have to happen. We have to absorb the light, convert the light into moving electrons, which is electricity, and then complete the circuit so that the moving electrons can do some work. And so our dye-sensitized solar cell, which is sometimes called a Grätzel cell because it was invented by Michael Grätzel from Switzerland. Here's a picture of him shown on the slide. The DSSCs have these layers that we will make. So we start out with a piece of glass that has layered on it a conducting oxide. So this, in our case, this is fluorine-doped tin oxide, FTO. And this allows the glass normally isn't conductive. So this layer is transparent to light, lets light go through it, but will also conduct electrons through the circuit. But then the real components of the dye are titanium dioxide that has been sensitized with a dye. So what that means is that we have added some kind of material onto the surface of the TiO2 that helps it absorb light. And then the other components are that we have some kind of cathode material on the other electrode. Ours is going to be graphite. And that our cathode and our anode are connected by an electrolyte, which in our case is going to be an iodide, triiodide redox electrolyte. And so basically the electrolyte is not just conducting charges from the cathode to the anode, but also electrons. So it's completing the circuit like a wire. And basically the way that that works is that we can have a redox reaction happen where the iodide can get oxidized to form triiodide and 2 electrons. And so that can happen at the TiO2 electrode, the cathode. And then at the anode, the graphite electrode, we can reduce the triiodide to form I-. Okay. So here's how we're going to make one. We're going to have these little pieces of glass that are 1 inch by 1 inch, and we're going to make a titanium dioxide layer. And then we're going to sensitize that titanium dioxide layer with fruit dyes. We'll coat another piece of glass with graphite from a pencil and sandwich those together with that redox electrolyte in between. Once we have a complete cell, then we can connect our cell through these little conductive parts to a multimeter where we can measure the voltage in the presence of either the sun or a light bulb. There's my light bulb. And so how does this work? So if we think about the valence band and the conduction band of the TiO2. Okay, so here's our TiO2. The sensitizing dye is represented by this S. So when light excites the dye, an electron moves from the ground state to the excited state. That we see that the energy of the excited state is above the energy of the conduction band of the TiO2. So that electron gets transferred to the conduction band, where it can then connect with the electrode and flow through the circuit. When it gets around to the graphite side, that electron can be used to reduce the triiodide to I-, and then that I- can interact with the hole that was left in the ground state of the dye to put an electron back there so that the whole thing can happen again. So the key here is to get the energy levels right between the energy of the dye, so that this needs to be in the visible region, because this band gap of the TiO2 is too big for visible light. So where the TiO2 doesn't normally absorb the light by itself, instead we're adding this dye to help it absorb. And so the best known dye for doing these Grätzel cells is called N719. And so this was try or notebook number 719 from a guy N. So that was his notebook number. And so it's this ruthenium coordination complex that has a metal to ligand charge transfer. And so basically these carboxylic acid groups help the dye connect to the TiO2. And there's been lots of studies about how that works. And then this complex has a metal to ligand charge transfer so that the electron basically moves from the ground state, that's mostly ruthenium, out to the ligand, and then that lets it transfer to the conduction band. We're not going to use those ruthenium dyes because they're expensive and we don't have them. Instead, we're going to use anthocyanin dyes from fruit. And so anthocyanins are a class of dyes. And so here's one example of such a molecule. And so these dyes can also use their functional groups to connect to the TiO2. And then they can get excited, which is probably a pi to pi star transition, which would also be very loud, very intense transition. And in so doing would transfer the excited state from the dye to the titanium so that the electron transfer can occur. So your goals for our experimental time are to make some dye-sensitized solar cells. I want you to compare in your report at least 3 fruit or food dyes. We'll have a variety available in the lab. And I want you to compare the performance of your cell under both incandescent light and sunlight to see what's different. You need to prepare at least 1 dye-sensitized solar cell yourself, and you can share data with your collaborators, so you can work that out. Here's some tips for success. So the conducting glass only has 1 conductive side. So the way we find that is we take our multimeter and we turn it to resistance ohms. And then we take the 2 leads and we put both of them on the same side of the glass. And if it is the conductive side, then it will have some measurable value of resistance. This particular glass is usually in the range of about 20 ohms, between 10 and 30. The non-conductive side will have what's an overload of resistance because the glass isn't conductive. It's only conductive where we have the layer of fluorine-doped tin oxide. So it will read OL, probably, depending on the particular multimeter you have, overload because the resistance will be too high to measure. So you can ask for help if you need help using a multimeter. When you're making your titanium dioxide paste on your cell, you want to make it as thin as possible. So it should look like a thin, almost transparent layer, while also making it complete so that it's not streaky. And then one piece that you'll probably need my help with is that we're going to sinter your titanium dioxide layer over a Bunsen burner. And what sintering means is that you're going to have these titanium dioxide nanoparticles on your slide, and then we're going to put it under a Bunsen burner flame. Okay, so here's our flame, and we're going to heat it. And then when we do that, it's going to fuse the titanium dioxide particles together so that now they are connected with each other. And so that's called sintering. Okay, so see Moodle for additional instructions about when you need to come to lab, and see the lab handout about additional instructions for what you're going to do in your report.